Okay, ערב טוב.
Good evening.
Finally. אני מתכבדת לפתוח את
I have the honor to open the last session of this first and very long day of the conference. The panel will deal with strategies for promoting return, the challenges faced by Palestinians and Israeli societies and the international community. This panel will be in 3 languages. There will be Hebrew, English, and Arabic. There will be 4 speakers, at the end of which we will open up the issue for questions and answers. We are already 10 minutes late. The first speaker is William Bill, and William Bill from civil society promoting the rights of the refugees. The second is Manar Makhoul from BADIL, the Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, and he will talk about strategies and recommendations for Israeli NGOs on realizing return. The third to speak is Khulood Badawi, and Palestinian civil rights activists, and she will talk about responsibility of the Palestinian society and organizations to realize right of return. And the last to speak is Gidon, Levy, a journalist, and he will talk about return as a demon, how to cope with the Israeli dread. The questions that will be answered by the speakers have to do with the role, the accountability, and the authority of in regards to realizing right of return, and about basically, from the key groups, the key communities, the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the international ones. And basically, the premise for this and the shaping of this session is based on the idea of the realization of the right for return. And we put this, at the feet of all 3 communities on how to do this, but also they also have different roles, and this is something that we have to acknowledge. They have different roles, different resources at hand, different responsibilities. So we're going to talk about the strategies and the challenges. Now, the basis of this issue, we must ask the question that was already asked in a previous session in the beginning of this day: what are the indications for success? Meaning, what do we include in as measures of success for the promotion of the right of return? Now, in the Gidon articles that we talked about, which is a common article of Zochrot and BADIL, we define that return is a long and ongoing and multifaceted process that includes not only the return, physical return of the refugees, but also the establishment of the new society that will be here. And so, right of return begins a long time before people actually come to Israel, and will continue a long time after they are here. Moreover, under the principles of the transitional justice paradigm, the central pillars of which are redemption or redress and justice, we know that we must base this on the acknowledgement and the actual acceptance of the Jewish awareness, the Jewish public, of the Hanakba. So we must ensure certainly the physical return of refugees, but also the right conditions for its implementation, the political conditions that have already been discussed, the social conditions, the cultural conditions, the changes in environment and legislation, and also terms to ensure that we do not continue the long tradition of conquest and depossession. So the mega question, if you would, is: how do we promote a reality, a political reality, that will lead to that kind of suitable political future? Lastly, I would like to cite, because if the first conference of Zochrot, which was in 2008, and we talked about this issue, and I want to go back to that seminal issue and refer us back to that, Yoni Ashpar said then, and I quote, "Even without knowing what the future will hold, I believe that we can determine that the right of return can be manifested only one in 2 ways, either by its forced on the Israeli public or by its agreement," meaning the agreement of a significant majority of the Israelis. Most believe today that only through coercion, military, political, economic, and so forth, can we force Israel to conclude its conquest and change its discriminatory address of the Palestinians and manifest the right of return for them. Meaning, do we do this? Can we force millions of people to absorb other millions of people, where those people, most of them, have never stepped foot on Israel? What kind of society will we establish? Is this a vision of reconciliation or a vision of a civic war? So,
to the lecture, Civil Society Promoting Refugee Rights, Encountering Collective Inertia, I would like to invite William Bell from Christian Aid. William works for UK NGO Christian Aid on their Middle East program. He works on policy development and related advocacy strategies on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially regarding the impact that occupation and conflict have on poverty and human rights. This includes research and report writing and lobbying the UK and Irish governments on their policies towards peace process. He regularly visits Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, and Lebanon, often with politicians and church leaders, in order to expose them to the reality of the situation here. His particular focus at the moment is on representation and marginalization of the Palestinian refugee community in historical peace negotiation, and how the refugee issue should be seen as part of achieving a viable solution to the conflict. He has a degree from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, in politics and history, and is currently studies for a Master in Peace Studies at Bradford University.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Zochrot, who are a partner of Christian Aid, I'm very proud to say. Part of the problem of going at the end of the day is so much has already been said that I'm no doubt going to repeat some of that. But I think it's probably true to say that if you repeat something enough, then usually it comes true. So maybe it's not a bad thing. This conference is exploring what the practical return of Palestinian refugees might look like and its implication for a wide base of stakeholders. What would it mean for the communities who have lived for decades in those towns, villages and houses that were once home to a Palestinian population that have now endured decades in refugee camps in the occupied Palestinian territory, in surrounding host countries, or who live further afield in Europe, the Americas or Australia? Whilst this is clearly a vital exercise in order to get to the heart of issues that impact Palestinians and Israelis, including those who believe that any discussion, let alone implementation, of the right of return is synonymous with a critical threat to the Jewish population in Israel, it doesn't tackle the collective inertia throughout the international community that prevents an understanding of the responsibility that we all have towards recognizing and protecting the rights of an extremely vulnerable population. Why have international NGOs not challenged this issue more while they have delivered their aid? Why have international donor governments been prepared to continue supporting the ever-increasing humanitarian needs of this population, but not pursue that which would end the need for aid? What are they all afraid of? Why is it still taboo in many international circles, including with some human rights agencies, to raise the issue of the Palestinian right of return? Why are we in this room still a small, almost very small minority? Before considering what they could and should do, it is important to lay out the facts and outline what needs to be done. That is, what the international community are currently failing to acknowledge and address, but must before they can engage on the practicalities of return. Palestinian refugees may not be a unique population, but their treatment by all, including their own political leadership, has led to a unique situation where their rights have been politicized at the expense of justice. There is a convenient tendency to ignore their rights and focus purely on their humanitarian needs. This is both short-sighted and an avoidance of facing up to the legitimacy of the rights of Palestinian refugees and, indeed, refugee rights per se. The international community has presided over a situation that has allowed a Kafkaesque categorization of Palestinians to prevail. A complex system of permits, travel documents, and refugee ID denies them their freedom of movement and self-determination. Where they currently live determines what legal document they hold, which is outside of their control. This may declare them to be any of the following: either residents or citizens of Israel, UN-registered refugees either in the occupied Palestinian territory or in a host country, in a region where they are afforded different rights and status according to the different laws of each particular state, internally displaced within Israel, Palestinian Authority passport holders in the occupied Palestinian territory, though not East Jerusalem residents, passport holders of states where they have been naturalized, and finally there are those who have no status, or who are not registered with the UN and are extremely vulnerable. The majority do not have the protection of a sovereign state, and each of these situations carries with it a variety of restrictions and obstacles preventing Palestinian refugees from living their lives with the full gambit of political and civil rights afforded to most individuals. This could be resolved if international inertia ended and their rights implemented. The displacement of refugees is not situated in a moment in time. It's an ongoing phenomenon. Whether it is the displacement of the Bedouin in the Nakab or Negev under the current Prava plan, or communities in the occupied Palestinian territory as a result of settlement expansion and the separation barrier, or of refugees across the wider region, displacement is part of a process that began in 1947 and constitutes a binding shared experience for many Palestinians, a shared narrative. Israel is a relatively young country, still in the early stages of nation building, but also built on a collective Jewish history and memory of displacement, dispersal, and persecution. Arguably, no other issue demonstrates the incompatibility of the two narratives so clearly as displacement. But that displacement continues, and the international community only protests but rarely acts. In some situations, the international community may be complicit in that displacement by recognizing illegal situations that arise as a result of settlement and wall construction. The continued presence of Palestinian refugees across the region living in an extreme uncertainty without protection or rights only contributes to further instability and conflict. Their fate has not been effectively discussed or addressed within peace negotiations to date, and yet they constitute more than half of the Palestinian population. As their humanitarian situation deteriorates, peace talks remain in stalemate, largely for two reasons. Many Palestinian refugees consider that their voices are effectively ignored by a Palestinian political leadership that appears to treat recognition of their legitimate rights as a price worth paying for achieving the bricks and mortar of a two-state solution based on 1967 borders. At the same time, many Israelis believe that the refugees and the right of return would mean the end of Israel as a secure state for Jews. Both populations regard this issue through an existential lens, rigorously defended by deeply embedded red lines, thus putting implementation, let alone recognition, of refugee rights off the agenda. The international community, both governments and NGOs, have perpetuated this situation by remaining silent, thus reinforcing the notion that this is indeed a taboo subject. Legal rights cannot be negotiated away by a political process without the consent or participation of the right holder. However, the lack of political will to tackle this issue, according to any appropriate or applicable law, is leading to a potential powder keg. The continued presence of overcrowded refugee camps in host countries can exacerbate conflict and instability. Thus, not only is there a moral and financial concern, there is also a common political interest at stake. It is not without precedence that Palestinians fear for their lives. The 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre, the Palestinians left stranded on the border between Iraq and Syria after the Gulf War in 2003, and the current conflict in Syria are stark reminders of the vulnerable position that Palestinian refugees face. Add to this the widening gap between funds required for UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies and actual income, and the result will inevitably be increased hardship and vulnerability. It is simply not sustainable to maintain humanitarian needs for an ever-growing population ad infinitum. The question must be, can we find the political will before the funds cease to match even the minimum need? And what will it take to create that political will? This discussion and our concern are not based on partial solidarity with the Palestinian people or about delegitimizing the state of Israel. It is about how Palestinians and Israelis build a viable future that delivers security and dignity for all. It is also about ensuring we preserve and uphold norms of international law for future conflict resolution and protection of individuals. It is worth noting that the UN and member states have established the precedents of legal and political frameworks to implement the right of return for refugees in other conflicts, for example, in the cases of Bosnia and Guatemala. The right of return is a principle that, with the passage of time and new demographic realities, has proved more controversial than almost any other aspect of the conflict, both for Israelis and Palestinians and the wider region. For many Israelis, it is a red line or an existential threat that seemingly cannot be discussed, let alone crossed. While the right of return is non-negotiable, this does not imply that every refugee returns to his or her exact place of origin, but it does require that Israel acknowledges and accepts responsibility for the plight of the refugees as a critical step before any forms of restitution, resettlement, and compensation can be addressed and the conflict move towards resolution. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is, in theory, the body that enforces the right of refugees to return to their country of origin. When the cause of the conflict is clear, the international community is called upon to assist refugees to repatriate. The right of return is not worded explicitly in the 1951 Refugee Convention, but it is based on customary international law, the four Geneva Conventions, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is both an individual right, with each refugee holding the right to return to their homes, and a collective right that forms a precursor to the implementation of the right to self-determination. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights clearly states that everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country, that everyone has the right to a nationality, and that no one should be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Israel has ratified several treaties that have come to codify the principles set out in the UDHR, namely the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Thus, the right of return is a principle recognised in international law. Acceptance of that principle, together with a practical but fundamental undertaking from the international community that it will financially and politically support all forms of restitution, would be a critical step towards a process of recognition and legitimisation of both peoples. Conversely, it is the delegitimisation of identity as well as narrative which deepens this conflict and pushes a viable solution further out of reach. As one refugee in Syria reminded Christian Aid, the Israelis never want to talk about the right of return because it threatens their identity. But for the refugees to forget, it also threatens their identity. People here want to have the right of return, and then they can choose to go back or not, but they don't want this choice taken away from them. Consistent treatment of Palestinian refugees by policymakers and indeed the international aid and development community, not as individuals with inalienable rights, but as a difficult issue to be deferred until final status talks, or as recipients of aid, has had a demoralising impact on the refugees and contributed to Palestinian rights remaining unimplemented. Using a rights-based approach, it is critical that civil society remind policymakers, both internationally and locally, of their obligation to respect the rights of refugees and to ensure that their future is not at the mercy of purely political concerns. Christian Aid looks at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a viability lens, that is, of guiding principles and rights rather than specific outcomes. At the centre of such a solution is the security and universal implementation of human rights, which thus must include recognition of Palestinian refugee rights, which we believe need to be addressed through the application of justice, while safeguarding that such a process doesn't incur another injustice. Our role must be to actively promote accountability and genuine representation while challenging discrimination. Many in the international community, including civil society, have overlooked refugee rights in order to support a very poor political process in which refugees themselves are not properly represented and their choices routinely disregarded. However, although the Oslo process has not delivered, for many it was a positive watershed in that it broke a taboo subject for some Israelis by raising the legitimacy of Palestinian statehood, whereas the refugee issue was notably postponed and continues to present a critical challenge for many to engage with. Negotiators and policymakers must now address it, and there is a comprehensive body of work to guide and inform them as they do so. This includes past official negotiations between the two sides and wider discussions among regional states and the international donor community. All have been supported by extensive technical analysis and, despite the lack of proper platform, refugees continue to provide testimony and opinion regarding their lives and wishes for the future. On a practical level, Christian Aid has been involved in an initiative to bring together diverse civil society actors to create a refugee and displacement working group made up of Israeli, Palestinian and international NGOs to work together to raise all of these issues with our governments and respective constituencies. The purpose of setting up the working group was to shatter the myth that no one could talk about refugee rights. By doing this, we are demonstrating to political stakeholders that it is possible to discuss this issue and that it should not be considered taboo. Another problem is the lack of unified responses to the refugee rights, which we are also addressing by trying to coordinate the work of civil society to have a greater impact. We are striving to pool resources of international civil society financially and through our projects and advocacy work, which could be a model for political stakeholders. It is especially incumbent upon all international NGOs to break the silence and accompany their humanitarian programs with advocacy that confronts these taboos and recognises legitimate rights, however politically difficult that may seem. This working group is an attempt to find a new way to raise the profile of this issue with a range of diverse stakeholders and change the current dynamic, and at the same time to help bring the refugee voice to the fore by reinforcing the need for proper representation. To conclude, these were the words spoken by a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon to a British Joint Parliamentary Middle East Council's Commission of Inquiry on Palestinian refugees in 2004. We should not repeat the mistake of the Israelis and make our existence in our land dependent on the non-existence of the people who are already living there. Israelis or Jews thought that their existence on the side of Palestine meant the non-existence of the other. We want the right of return as an individual and a collective claim to the land we were expelled from. We do not wish to tell them to leave or for a fragmentation of their state. It is long overdue to test the commitment of that statement and that sentiment. Our job must be to start the dialogue that breaks down the barriers and challenges that are condemning an entire population to a life without hope or dignity and sustains an illusory vision that peace and security can be achieved without justice and the protection and implementation of people's rights. Civil society can make a difference if it engages with grassroots organisations that work with refugees and help to guarantee that the refugee voice is heard and properly represented within any negotiations. Together, we can challenge the predispositions which exist throughout the international community that have obstructed the right of return both in theory and in practice. It is time that the international community stopped merely treating the symptoms and started in earnest to deal with the causes of this issue. Providing them with potential practical solutions is clearly important, as it demonstrates that the future can be positive and productive for all. But for us, in Europe, America and beyond, where the taboo still exists, we have a duty to break it. Thank you.
Thank you, William. You saved us 4 minutes. Okay, to the next lecturer, I would like to ask Manar. His lecture is Strategies and Recommendations for Israeli NGOs on Realizing Return and Promoting Justice. Manar Makhoul from BADIL is a networking and advocacy officer at BADIL. He finished his PhD in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge in 2012. He studied international relations and contemporary Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you, Manar.
Thank you very much, Liat. Thank you, Zochrot, especially Omar, for inviting us here. I'm very happy to be speaking here. I have been given the task of addressing the Israeli NGOs and trying to give them strategies and ways in order to achieve Auda, return. That's a huge task, and frankly, I really don't know where to begin, especially, like William said before, there is a lot of repetition today, but this repetition is good, and I think we're coming in this conference towards some sort of common denominator on identifying commonalities, and that will be the fertile ground for further discussion. So today we heard many interesting and intersecting ideas on transitional justice, different models of state, the model of the state that we would like to have. But I would like to stress, and I thought that this was something that was absent in most of the discussions and most of the presentations today, which is the context of the conflict. And this is particularly important when we would like to address the Israeli civil society, Israeli NGOs, with regards to the issue of return. This context has been either taken for granted or ignored or has been forgotten. Israeli NGOs, I think, need to go back to basics, and this is what I will try to do in this presentation. Briefly, in BADIL, we call this context in our analysis, but this is not something that is unique to us, and other people call it like this, but we call it the ongoing Nakba. The ongoing Nakba has temporal and spatial elements, to which I will refer briefly, and it has also legal, political, and military manifestations. Before I go into the details of these elements, I would like to use an anecdote that was, I don't know if it was clear to everybody in the room, from today, about when talking about Palestinian refugees. Most of the presentations today started taking or defining the refugee problem in 1947, 1948. Some people started it in 1949. But there is a peculiar situation in which there's a distortion between identifying the problem of 1948 refugee as a starting point and then referring to the solution, to the two-state solution, which the starting point of that is 1967, or 1967 borders. And there's a peculiar situation here that I would like to break down by going to the basic definitions that I spoke about. Basically, I am going to say that Israeli NGOs and Israeli society in general is locked in a Zionist Israeli discourse that is imposed on society, and we need to dismantle it in order to address it or to solve it or try to get into a solution. So the main question that I would like to answer in this presentation, it refers to the issue of mandate that Liat referred to, is do Israeli NGOs, or for that matter, William, international NGOs, really adapt the correct understanding for the root causes of the conflict? Do they? In this presentation, I would like to offer that the answer to this question is widely negative, if we take Zochrot out of the equation especially. This means, the negative answer to this question is that because the work of Israeli NGOs or international NGOs is based on a flawed premise, it is underproductive or even counterproductive to the solving of the refugee problem. So, in order to do so, we need to define the context. The ongoing Nakba started basically, from my point of view, with the establishment of Zionism. This is the engine that runs the whole process of ongoing displacement of Palestinians, and which has not been dealt deeply today. So Zionism produces the ongoing displacement in all the space of Palestine. All the space of Palestine, some people refer to it as historic Palestine or mandate Palestine. I call it Palestine. I used it in another presentation that we cannot refer to Palestine as in terms of versions, historic Palestine or mandate Palestine or beta Palestine or 10.1.2 Palestine. There's only one Palestine, the land of Palestine, and the colonization of Palestine started with the creation of the Zionist movement, and this should be the starting point. Therefore, spatially speaking, the analysis of the displacement of Palestinians should be applied to all of Palestine. Temporally speaking, in terms of time, the displacement of Palestinians started or began even before 1947, and it continues in the whole space of Palestine until today. So if you are talking about Palestinian refugees, we talk about Palestinian refugees in 1948, one of which sits with us here in the room. But we are talking about Palestinian refugees from Naqab, from Susia, from Haifa, from Akka, and from Jaffa from 2013. Because the mechanisms of displacement of the Zionist discourse, of the Zionist endeavor, applies to all of Palestine. And this is applied in legal, political, and military regimes. For example, if we are talking about the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the groupings that William spoke about, you have Palestinian citizens of Israel, you have Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, you have Palestinian residents of the West Bank, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and Palestinian refugees outside. These are political definitions, political fragmentations of the Palestinian questions that are also geographic. But we need to overcome this. So the tools that the Zionist endeavor uses, including the occupation of 1967, means, I would like to use the definition in order to go back to the basics, that Israel has a temporary right to administrating the West Bank and Gaza, but is not allowed to exercise sovereignty over them. Another form of Zionism, another characteristic of Zionism, if you will, is colonization. And colonization is defined as the acts of a state have cumulative outcome that it annexes or otherwise unlawfully retains control over territory and thus aims to permanently deny the indigenous population the exercise to right of self-determination. This colonization of Palestine has begun in 1948, not in 1967, and this is ongoing until today. And the importance of this acknowledgement, the importance of this recognition will be clarified in the second section of my presentation. And the third element of Zionism is apartheid, which is taboo in Israeli society, a term that is strongly rejected. But apartheid is defined, in order to be able to use it, we need to define it as a political system where racism is regulated in law through acts of parliament, or is a form of legal or racial segregation, or the purpose of establishing the maintaining of domination but by one racial group or persons over another racial group, and systematically oppressing them, in particular by means of segregation, expropriation of land, and etc. However, we need to remember that there is one vital difference between the apartheid in Israel and apartheid in South Africa, is that apartheid in Israel is temporary. Israel does not want itself to be an apartheid state, because apartheid in Israel is not meant to continue the domination of one racial group over the other. The apartheid in Israel is meant in order to forcibly displace the Palestinians from here. When the moment arrives that there are no Palestinians, there will be no need for apartheid in Israel. And we need to distinguish this, difference. Other legal tools, the legal tools in which, just to list them, residency rights, like we said in Jerusalem, construction of the apartheid wall, the restrictive zoning, and all these things. So all the apartheid and racial discrimination that happens in Israel and the political and legal categorizations of Palestinians, how does this affect the work of NGOs? I think taking for granted these legal discrimination, it's a natural process. When we want to analyze the legal status of Palestinians in Jerusalem, we need to refer to the Israeli legal system, the Israeli laws, the Israeli administration, in order to analyze the particular characteristics of this population. The same refers to Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and so on. But taking this natural route, or this organic route of the development of NGOs, has put us in a trap of inherently accepting the imposition of the Zionist fragmentation of the Palestinian situation, or the Palestinian nation. And this is one of the main issues that I think the Israeli NGOs and all NGOs, for that matter, need to address. And this is something that, if we're talking about the issue of mandate, Liat, for example, in BADIL, we do not distinguish between different groups of Palestinian refugees, Palestinian internally displaced persons inside Israel, and so on. All of Palestinian refugees although they have different characteristics, but they should be dealt as seeing them through this whole prism, this holistic approach, this holistic understanding of the context of the mechanisms of that generates the problem. Therefore, although humanitarian assistance is required, and William referred to this briefly, for alleviating the human cost of suffering, what many international NGOs and Israeli NGOs do, they offer humanitarian aid or assistance in particular areas, in particular emergency situations. It cannot solve the root cause of the conflict, the ongoing displacement, the Zionist ideology that runs the whole operation, if you will. Therefore, working, for example, against house demolition in Jerusalem, going to the site of the demolished house, or offering humanitarian aid to the family that has just been evicted and became refugees, or trying to help people that are going to be evicted from their land, or any other work, any humanitarian work that doesn't take into consideration the global, let's say, or the root causes of the conflict, would be as like dealing with the symptoms, but not dealing with the problem itself. Another problem with the work of NGOs is what's called the politically driven approach, which basically takes into consideration the interests of countries and the balance of power between them on the expense of human rights. However, I would like to offer an alternative to this, although some of the presentation, especially in the morning, deemed it as unrealistic, which is the human rights-based approach, and I would modify it because of the criticism and the debate that has been going on from the stage today. I would call it the intelligent human rights-based approach, or the adaptive human rights-based approach, which is not, as it was described simplistically, as taking the rights on face value and being completely blind to the evolving context, or for example, after 65 years of building a society in Israel and so on, we cannot ignore that. Anybody who is blind to the evolving context would be shooting himself in the foot. Because I don't have a legal background, thank God, I would like to read the definition for you from the paper. A human rights-based approach encompasses the norms, principles, standards, and goals of the international human rights and best practices of states, with its organs and processes seeking to ensure human dignity and justice. It is characterized by mechanisms, methods, tools, and activities which are designed to complement the notion of humanity's struggle for freedom, equality, justice, development for all. By its, this is the general definition, by its narrow or strict definition, for example, stability, safety, and security, peace cannot be recognized without fundamentally protecting human rights and freedoms that are violated. It is important to note that the failure to adapt and or implement human rights-based approach in the course of seeking durable solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not and should not be attributed to the complexity of the conflict and relevant issues or an identified will. The right of return, this is the perspective of BADIL, of forcibly displaced Palestinians is central to a sustainable peace, sustainable peace because it is a matter of direct, material, and ethical concern to millions of Palestinians and other Arab people who need to see the root causes of the protracted conflict. That is, Zionist Israel's racist policies and practices of colonialism, ethnic cleansing, which began with the Palestinian Nakba, will no longer be tolerated, but instead be removed and corrected in the context of peacemaking. In my colleague's presentation tomorrow, Thaer, who will speak about the mechanisms, if you will, the practical approach to return and how we transform this idea into practice. Therefore, I would leave it to him, so stay tuned. Negotiations undertaken by parties, international organizations and concerned states should aim to establish a safeguard and implement the rights of all parties to the conflict. This is something that is crucial and central and core value of rights-based approach. And this is something, if we're going to address now, not the Israeli NGOs, but the Israeli society, is something about reassuring them about that the implementation of the right of return does not mean the causing of another displacement of Jewish Israelis. This is a core issue, and again, Thaer, my colleague, will refer to this tomorrow. The human rights-based approach necessarily should include these 3 points, and I will finish with this. Recognition of rights, in particular the Palestinian people's rights for self-determination, the right of refugees and internally displaced persons to repatriation, voluntary return, property restitution, and or compensations. The right of development to freely dispose and enjoy the natural wealth and resources and cultural heritage, and the right to peace. The second point, ensuring rights to all parties and victims without discrimination and without causing injustices or mass displacement or elimination of the other during the course of enabling rights holders to exercise their legitimate and legal rights. And the third point, setting the foundations of peaceful and cooperative relations between people, groups, individuals, and states. This will be an intrinsic component of a just peace and is essential to reconciliation, which in turn will be achieved through implementing transitional justice, which was referred to, both judicial and non-judicial mechanisms and tools, including criminal prosecution, repatriation, institutional reform, and truth commissions. I would like to stop here, and I will be happy to take your questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manar. Okay, and to the third lecture, I would like to invite Khulood Badawi. Khulood's lecture is the responsibility of Palestinian society and organizations to realize the right of return. Khulood is a former head of the Arab Students Committee at Haifa University, first woman to be elected as head of National Arab Student Union in Israel, office coordinator of Itiha, parliament assistant of former Issa Makhoul, group facilitator at Adam Institute for Democracy and Peace, Akri field researcher on the separation wall, Akri and BIMCOM project coordinator of planning and building rights in East Jerusalem, Media and Information Coordinator at Humanitarian Affairs Associate at the UN in the OPT, and currently works as a political and human rights consultant, chairwoman of Hirak Center, the Hirak Center, the Center of Advancement of Higher Education in the Arab Society, chairwoman of the Foundation Executive Board, Jenin Freedom Theater. Thank you.
Okay. سات عربية تخشى ولا تعرف رح أحكي بالعربي بعرفش إذا مع الكل في طيب يعطيكم العافية.
Okay, well, I will not extend my remarks. I can see that you're all very tired and you want to sleep by now. I would like to talk very briefly about our strategy, we the Palestinians here in Israel, and I will talk about the institutions in Palestinian society from 48 in Israel. I am not going to talk, I know that there are many Arabs among us, but still I'm going to talk in a very brief way. I'm going to talk about our role, we the Palestinians within Israel, and also our institutions from 48 onwards. I would like to criticize Zochrot a little bit. First of all, well done, and keep the strength for doing such a wonderful conference. And I think certainly that there's a need that every year there's such a conference talking about these things, and also will help us, bring us closer to the realization of the right of return. And thank you very much, Domo, that worked very hard with me to do this. But my criticism is that there are so many institutions that I don't see them here, and this is an international conference. There should be local institutions and organizations represented, internal Palestinians, and there also has to be a tracking conference and so forth. And we ourselves, as the people within Israel, we also have to, should have called the Displaced Persons Committee. I think that I'm missing quite a few representatives here and their institutions and so forth. They should have been here, and they should have been as speakers, and they should have been as an audience. Also, the Zochrot organization is one of the first that began documenting and working in the field within Israel and everything that has to do with the right of return. And we certainly acknowledge their amazing work within Israel, but I am missing these active people that I know are working in the field, Jews, and I'm sorry that also not here. I would like to see more Palestinians as well here, maybe in the next conference of Zochrot, maybe the next conference will be in an Arab Palestinian city and not in Tel Aviv and not in Sheikh Munis. And I think that's my one criticism, so that we can look at things in a broader perspective next time. Now I'm going to talk about our responsibility as the Palestinian society and what our responsibility is towards this issue of right of return. In my opinion, our first role is to emphasize constantly the fact that we cannot separate between citizenship and our right to return to our villages and our cities within Israel. As long as there is a separation and a division between these issues, between the rights and between responsibilities, the human rights, civil rights, and so forth, as long as we are constantly dealing with demanding our rights, I think first of all, our first strategy should be to emphasize our citizenship, the citizenship of Palestinians as people who are natives of this country. We cannot give up the right to equality in a country that defines itself as an equality country. We cannot be whole without connecting this right and that right, without demanding our right as displaced people to come back to our villages and our towns. Moreover, when we talk about our role as institutions, organizations, we first have to define which institutions and organizations already exist in our society. And I think that today we as institutions, whether political parties, whether the tracking committee, which is also quite a political institution, we must acknowledge the fact that we have to work in a corollary fashion. We have to we cannot work on separate issues. We cannot separate between civic society on the one hand and the parties on the political other side, on the other side of the aisle. I think we have to reunify things and find a strategy which is one cohesive strategy and present it to the political parties and coordinate it with the organizations of civic societies, meaning civil society has to lead us to the manifestation, the realization of the right of return. We as Palestinians within Israel, we have to work in the field in specific areas according to specific plans, and we must, as a Palestinian society, shift from demanding the right to return to as a right of return as a vision to a reality, to try to create its implementation. I think that we have several examples on the ground, so to speak, which are wonderful. They're blessings and they're fantastic, but they're not enough if we don't take this idea that we can do this as well also in displaced villages. For example, in everything that's happening in Ikre, there is a group of young men and women there that have initiated a return to their villages, and this is a realization and of the right of return, as it is. They're doing it. They worked together along with human rights organizations and along with legal organizations and civic society organizations, and they work together, and this is one of the initiatives, but there are also many other initiatives in other displaced Tafunya, Manar, and other places. The trap that we constantly fall into is that we are constantly busy with, reviving the memory of the Nakba and not having real models and specific activities, perhaps restricted, but specified to specific sites. We do not move from local action to national action, and we lack this kind of strategy that will help us make the shift between working in Ikre, which is actually a successful example, taking that example to other areas that can suit villages and towns in other areas of displaced people. We have to raise awareness of ourselves, of us Palestinians, and also generally in Israeli society, and say that you cannot just talk about the right of return of all Palestinians everywhere in the world without that there be a right of return to the displaced people within Israel, meaning you cannot realize right of return and implement right of return of people outside Israel when there are internal displaced people right here that are not returned to their homes. So we now are in the Oslo trap as well, that takes us from one problem to another. We have to emphasize this fact that if we want that our activity to succeed, then everything to do with the right of return, then we must say that you cannot realize this right for all Palestinians around the world without first beginning with people here in Israel. So you have to begin from that group here, the Israeli Palestinians that are still here. We have to, all of us here in this auditorium, work together so that we can bring the displaced people of Israel back to their places, back to their original villages. And only if everybody works together to make this a reality, only then will we be successful. We, the Palestinians of Israel, we have a great privilege, and we have to make that privilege into a force. We, within Israel, our situation here in Israel allows us to map all of the data on the ground, all of the information, and debunk all of the Israeli allegations claiming that the right of return cannot be implemented. We have various routes. We can map them out. We can know how much land there is. How many refugees can be returned to Israel. We must and should be the initiators of this, and we must build models or plans or blueprints for Palestinian villages in the possible areas so that we can implement right of return for all of the people. It cannot be that the state of Israel that has so many empty spaces within it that can bring in new immigrants from all over the world. It cannot be that it's not logical that they can bring in all of those people and we stand by and just look at this unfolding, constantly making our empty demands without actually initiating things ourselves and working with the Palestinians of all political and engineering planes, everybody. We can't just sit on the sidelines and make plans and make blueprints and plan areas and spaces for residential areas. We can't do this. We can't just give plans for models for Palestinian towns. We also have to present our alternative, our solution. We have to remind others that if Israel wants to return the refugees and to realize right of return and to bring them to Israel into their homeland within the 48 boundaries, then this alternative is feasible and can be done. And if we do it the right way, if we present this alternative the right way, we can show that it's just a political decision at the end of the day. It's the implementation of the right to return. It doesn't have to do with the fact that there are areas or no. There are, in fact, open areas, but the decision is a political decision. The State of Israel must make this decision, and it is our role as the Palestinians of this country to work towards that goal and to make it a reality. We have to have a strategy. We constantly are, walking around in circles, one Memorial Day to another Memorial Day, and so forth. We don't have a real clear strategy that connects between all of the various existing institutions and parties and organizations that must work together and collaborate in order to walk forward to implement this goal. We should be the initiators. We, the Palestinians of 48, have a basic key role here. We have to challenge all of the Israeli organizations, and particularly the peace and left-wing organizations of Israel, that we must prove that this right can be realized, particularly for Palestinians within Israel that have never left the country but have been displaced. And we have to show that this is possible. And if we do succeed in bringing back the displaced Palestinians within Israel, then this can prove that, yes, we can also bring back the people from abroad. And I think that the role of Zochrot is very important. The efforts that are made by all of the Palestinians and Israeli organizations and the political parties, these actions must be a collaborative work which is much, much more powerful. We should leave alone this old viewpoint that we are all fighting for precedence. We of civic society organizations must collaborate. We should not compete one with the other. And at the end of the day, we must not forget that the big challenge is that we must always be aware of the fact that we can talk about right of return until the end of days, but we should be aware of the fact that implementation of the right of return is something that's possible, and the State of Israel can choose between doing this willingly or being coerced to do it. And the millions of Palestinians, refugees, do have room here. If Israel gives up its self-definition as a Jewish state, if it's willing to give up its definition of Palestinians as a demographic threat, if they can institute a policy which gives up its racism and starts looking at Palestinians as collaborators, and if that happens, we can all have room here, and we all know this country. We all know that there are open spaces, empty spaces where we can have people reside. There is enough land, there is enough territory, and the question is only if there is will. And the biggest challenge before Israel in regards to right of return is if we begin to implement it from Israel willingly, then first of all return the internal domestic displaced people here to Safuria, to Ma'ar, to Termil, to all of the areas that they were taken away from here in Israel. If we manage to return to those places, return them to those places within Israel, then there's no doubt that the people, the Palestinian refugees that are outside of Israel, anywhere outside in the world, will understand that they can come back, and at the end of the day, this is a political decision that has only to do with political will of the international community and, of course, of the state of Israel and its administration that gives up racism. If there's no political pressure, I don't see that it will ever be possible to do this. If there's no demand of the left wing of Israel, then we certainly need that pressure. We need pressure from inside and outside. This is a lot of work. This is difficult world. And Zochrot, we must examine with them why the institutions that I mentioned are not among us and not represented. We need an answer for that. And I think that there is a need as well to begin planning the right of return through implementation of plans and of the replacing of dispossessed people here in Israel, and start planning where do we build, where do we get funding for this building. There are open spaces that we can build on. If the state of Israel says that it's impossible, then we should certainly expose this issue, and I think that we should begin implementing this and not just talk about it, and start from home.
Thank you very much, Khulood. הדובר האחרון, גדעון לוי. גדעון הוא עיתונאי ישראלי.
We will be hearing from Gidon Levy, an Israeli journalist, a member of the Haaretz editorial, and ever since 1988 has been covering the situation of the Palestinian population in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, and the influence of Israelis' activities, especially soldiers and settlers, on this population. He has won several awards for his journalistic activities, and he is going to talk about the return as a demon, how to cope with the Israeli dread. For you to say Judea and Samaria, is that why we came here today for that? You deleted Ramat Aviv, so all of a sudden you say Judea and Samaria? I'm, of course, very happy to be here. I'm very happy for the fact that such a conference is taking place. I'd like to begin with a word about myself, because I think that people can learn something broader from that. I grew up in Tel Aviv in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I was a goody two-shoes, according to any standard, and as a very typical creation of the Israeli educational system and media. I remember that Arab ruins never interested us. We never asked any question. We never asked exactly what is this home, where are the tenants. And back then there were more Arab ruins today than what we see today. And definitely there were Arab houses that were settled by Jews, and that didn't interest us at all. And I even remember my first trip back in '67 with my parents to the West Bank. And even back then, I have no memory of asking anything or wondering about anything. I don't even remember seeing people on that tour. I just remember how we were so excited to visit the tomb of Rachel, the cave of the patriarchs, the Western Wall. It was just 2 or 3 weeks after the end of the war. I had a friend whose father was a lieutenant colonel in the military, and we received permission to go there. So we went there, and we were so excited. And I just didn't see people anywhere. Didn't think about people. But even after I started to sober up or to grow up or go crazy or become sane, depending on your perspective, Even in my earlier years, as somebody covering the occupation, definitely during my years as a Zionist left-winger, I remember how I always said we need to draw a line on 48, otherwise there'll never be an end to it. We need to start from today onward and not look back. And 1948 ended, 1948 is over, we don't need to deal with that. This is what I thought, this is how I talked. Until gradually, and it was a process that lasted several years, all of a sudden I discovered that 1948 had never ended, so there is no way to just cross it out or draw a line over it, because 1948 still continues today, because the policy is the exact same policy, the motives are the exact same motives, the worldview is exactly the same worldview, and the goals are almost the same goals. In the past 2 weeks, I visited Khulood Makhoul in the Jordan Valley 3 times. This is where we will hold, this will be the subject of our next conference on return, because I fear that ultimately they'll break down and be uprooted from their village. So what's the difference between 1948 and 2013? And it took me a few more years to understand that if we don't talk about 1948, if we don't reach out to take care of that festering wound from 1948, then we won't resolve anything. Maybe there will be more Oslos, more agreements, more signing, and more photo ops. But a true, just agreement, we will never have that if we don't reach out and deal with what happened in 1948. Of course, there is no scarier demon, no greater taboo, no a cow that's more sacred than the right of return. It is such a big demon that nobody even tries to ask himself or herself, what are we talking about actually? What is this all about? It is definitely taboo, and even organizing a conference on the right of return is almost considered illegitimate. Not almost, it is considered to be illegitimate by most Israelis. Dealing with this subject is not considered to be legitimate. So I suggest that we shouldn't be afraid of that, because let me remind all of us that we had some other demons in our past, just as threatening, just as scary, that gradually evaporated over the years. And I think that this concept of Palestinian state used to be a threat for most Israelis, and I think we forget the 1970s, in which to even say these two words together, a Palestinian state, it's almost like saying the right of return today. People thought it would be the end of the Zionist endeavor. It is heresy. It is setting the borders of Auschwitz. This is what people from the center of the political map said. The borders of Auschwitz, this concept was not coined by Israel Eldad or Menachem Begin. It was Abba Evan who said that, and some other examples. Before that, they scared us with the infiltrators, and only when I read Benny Morris's book, only then I began to realize the difference, the gap between what they told us about these infiltrators and what actually did occur. As a child in the 1950s, I definitely had no way to deal with that. And even recognizing the PLO used to be considered tremendous heresy. Even saying the word occupation was considered to be heresy. And of course, the borders of 67, etc., and all that jazz, and all that repertoire of an ongoing scare campaign that started before 1948 and hasn't actually ended, not even today. And today, now that we've gotten rid of some of the earlier demons, we're left with this demon that nobody deals with, and that's the demon of the right of return. And since I think that the Israeli society is Before it's arrogant and racist and patronizing and all these things, it is a society that endless fears and anxieties have been inculcated into it. So anybody who wishes to resolve anything with the Israeli society needs to overcome the fear, because the fear, and it doesn't matter if this fear results from authentic reasons or manipulations, but it's there. And let me remind you here that in the reality of 2013, there are hardly any young people in Israel who have ever met a Palestinian, except for those who serve in the IDF, of course, and their encounter is of a very specific nature. There are hardly any Israeli Jews who've met an Israeli Arab for that. And on the other hand, they're faced with the greatest collaborator with the Israeli conquest, with these scare campaigns, and that is, of course, the Israeli media in general, of course, with certain exceptions. And this is a topic for another lecture, but I have no doubt that if it weren't for the role portrayed by the Israeli media in the past decades, then it could very well be that the occupation would have lasted less time, would have ended earlier, and perhaps the way to resolve the Palestinian problem would have been much easier and much shorter. That scare campaign of the Israeli media long before the right of return is a campaign that includes two elements, of course, in a methodic, daily, systematic way, and I won't get into it because it definitely merits a separate talk. There are two means. On the one hand, the demonization, this constant demonization. You just need to remember, for example, the days before Operation Cast Lead. If you can only think back about the descriptions in the Israeli media that all of the Gaza Strip is booby-trapped and the Iranian weapons flowing through the tunnels, the Iranian missiles that will reach, and we all know how it ended and what happened in Operation Cast Lead. This daily demonization leads us to a situation that an Israeli thinks that going to Ramallah is a heroic trip, that nobody comes back from it alive, a kind of a new Red Rock, because these are the fears that are being instilled in him time and again in the media, and not for ideological reasons. No, not at all. It's only for commercial reasons, because they sow these anxieties not just from the Palestinians. Today it's polio, tomorrow, the day before it was this swine flu, excuse me. Of course there was a lynch in Ramallah, but there are also car accidents, yet people still drive cars on the roads. I'm not saying in any way whatsoever that the Israeli fears or these scare campaigns are without a reason. I'm not saying that for 1 minute, but there are people who are capitalizing and enhancing these without any proportion. And when there is no encounter, no meeting between the two nations, every Palestinian is considered to be something very threatening, as a possible suicide bomber. And just look around you and speak with Israelis. An Israeli today thinks that going to Kalanswa is life-threatening. Taxi drivers, I've heard, won't drive to Jaffa, and this fear is sowed somewhere, and there are reasons for this fear, and there are people who also make sure that that these fears are maintained. And of course, there's the issue of demonization, the systematic demonization that has been going on for years, portraying the Palestinians as not exactly human beings like us, without getting into too many details. I'm not even talking about the fact that we're the chosen people, and this is also another value that's deeply rooted in the Israeli existence. But let's set that aside. The demonization And the most important agent of this demonization is the Israeli media in general. Of course, there are certain exceptions, and this demonization, of course, enables Israelis to feel so good about themselves without any moral deliberations regarding the occupation, without asking any special questions about what the world thinks, moral questions, or even logical questions. How can it be that 5 million Jews think one thing, but 7 billion people think differently? Is it reasonable? Does it make sense? We should ask ourselves, perhaps we are somewhere mistaken. And this dehumanization is, of course, the instrument that helps us live with everything that's happening in peace, because if the Arabs are not exactly human beings like we are, then the issues of justice, human rights, and international law, this question is a bit less relevant. And, of course, I'm putting it quite mildly. And I'm talking about a systematic campaign that has been going on for decades, day in, day out, and you can just read and analyze the newspapers and the newscasts, and I don't want to get into it because I don't have too much time. So within this context of dehumanization and demonization of a very deep fear, it doesn't matter whether or not it is justified, a fear of the Arab, of the Palestinian, a fear of 67 borders, the PLO. Of course, the scare of the right of return once again enters this framework. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that there aren't any risks associated with the right of return. I'm not arguing that this could be easily resolved. But, of course, this scare campaign is such that it doesn't even allow us to begin to discuss this topic. It doesn't even allow us to feel that it's legitimate to bring this up as a problem. Not to even mention the existence of the problem and still be considered as an Israeli, a patriot, a citizen, a normative person. At the late 1980s, one day Ariel Sharon called me up, and of course I wasn't on friendly terms with him, but we did have some kind of a relationship. Back then he was just a member of Knesset. He called me up and he suggested that both of us go together to the Gaza Strip. Of course, I happily agreed. We met in his ranch. I forgot the name of that ranch. And so we left Arik, Sharon, little old me, and the driver. That's it. No security guards or anything. We left for the west, for Gaza. He was a charming person. Of course, he knew how to put on all his charm and tricks for me, and I was enchanted by him because it was very difficult not to be seduced by him. Just trying sitting at that ranch in the evening for supper, and Arik showed me the grapes Lily would bring him every evening to bed, and of course, this did the work with such a young journalist as I was back then. And the purpose of the tour was to explain to me why we must never pull out of Gaza, why we must never leave Gaza. That's, of course, the bottom line. He said that the West Bank isn't so bad, but he said we must never, never abandon the Gaza Strip. That was the purpose of that tour. We toured there for an entire day. It was fascinating. And then we were standing on this hilltop and we saw the refugee camps of the central area of the Gaza Strip. So I asked him, Arik, what about these people? What will happen to them? And the answer is documented, because immediately after this tour, I published this in Haaretz newspaper. He allowed me to publish all of my impressions, and that's what I did. And Sharon, him, not somebody else, he said, some of them we will transfer into Israel to mixed villages or towns or Arab cities, Arab villages, and the others, we in the world, we will rehabilitate them here. It is within our interest. And I even asked him a number, and he answered, because I simply looked back at what I wrote then. It's not that I remember, but it was talking about the 80,000 people of Gaza who will move into Israel. And when he was dealing with Gaza, by the way, he also built a few exemplary neighborhoods where he housed refugees. He understood that The refugee problem cannot remain as is. So why am I telling you this story? Because he talked about the return of 80,000 people as a starting point. And the sky didn't fall. And it was published in Haaretz newspaper, and nobody jumped up and made a big deal out of it. Back then, it was different times. The anxieties were different kinds of anxieties. Today, I think that if anybody suggests to move 80,000 people from Gaza into Israel, immediately a law will immediately be passed that will ban coming up with suggestions or proposals. Anybody who will even propose that is a heretic, and of course there will be a majority in the Knesset to ban such suggestions. But it was Sharon, not somebody else, who suggested it. And let me tell you another personal experience, and then I'd like to recap. A few years ago, people always tell me, you live in Sheikh Mounis, you live in Sheikh Mounis, and I met a refugee from Sheikh Mounis a few years ago in a small village next to Jenin. He was quite old. It was a very moving meeting. I told him that I swim in the pool here every morning, and he tells me that this was the pool with which they irrigated the orchards in this area. And I toured with the Zochrot in Ramat Aviv, and I've become an expert tour guide in Ramat Aviv to show that half house and the cemetery that you all know that, of course, is in the parking lot of the Israeli Shabak. That's a weird twist of history. I once came close to the cemetery. It's an open parking lot. It's before the entrance to the Shabak. And of course, they immediately came and arrested me. And let me remind you of the unforgettable image of the mosque in the Zacharia Moshav. Anybody traveling in that area, I recommend that you enter this Moshav. It's called Zacharia, and there's a turret of a mosque because we always did keep the mosque. There's a mosque turret in excellent condition. There's a fence surrounding it. What does it say in that fence? Careful, dangerous building. This dangerous careful, dangerous building. I think this is the role that you and us, this small minority, need to take on ourselves, and we need to begin to break apart these fears. And whenever they still listen us, we should take this demon that's called the right of return and to deconstruct it. I was once in a refugee camp in Jordan, and I heard many refugees there. I spent a week there. And lo and behold, not all of them want to come back here. Not everybody is so delighted to come and live here. I mean, you know, we can find a solution for this problem. We can deconstruct it. I think there are 3 ways to do that, but that's a political matter. And of course, who am I? But first of all, the first stage must be, and there will be nothing without it, recognition, official Israeli recognition for the responsibility, for the injustice. And I always compare, and I'll do that here as well. I'm not, of course, comparing anything to the Holocaust, God forbid, because everybody will jump all over me. But Willy Brandt's kneeling in Yad Vashem was a formative event. My dream, and I've written about this more than once, to see an Israeli prime minister who will take responsibility because a crime has been done, injustices have been done in 48, and of course ever since. One prime minister who will take, first of all, moral responsibility. And I think that if there is ever such a person who will speak on behalf of this country, of course, then we've taken the first step. The next steps, these are things that we need to talk about, and that we should talk about, to swipe it beneath the carpet and to present it as something that shouldn't even be mentioned. This, of course, only exacerbates the problem and does not solve it. Throughout my years as a reporter, I saw more people with keys than one can even imagine. And I'm talking about the third generations that are carrying their keys on them. They won't forget their home. They won't forget their village. It's deeply rooted in their consciousness. One cannot erase it. It passes from one generation to another. And the only way to deal with it is to begin to, first and foremost, talk about it. And then there are political solutions. And I suggest to at least try to remind the Israelis that back in the 90s we took in 1 million Russians, about 1/3 to 1/2 of them weren't Jewish, and yet the Jewish nature of the state of Israel was not harmed. If it's important to someone, it's not that important to me, but I know that there are people who do care about this. And just like Khulood said, it must begin with the most obvious thing, that's the IDPs. I'm not talking about the decisions of the High Court of Justice that were not realized. I'm not talking about the government decisions, the decisions of the Likud government, not the Labour government, but the Likud government that called to send back the DPs to their houses in Ikrit, and that didn't happen. But we need to start to talk about it. We need to write about it. Maybe it will sound quite strange and crazy, just like it sounded so crazy when we initially talked about an occupied territory back in '67. Let me remind you, I think we are all older people here. Back in '67, we didn't even know how to call the territories. Some people called these the liberated territories. There was a small group, a very tiny small group that dared say occupied territories on the radio. They would say the kept or held territories, and even a compromise was suggested, and they came up with a new word in Hebrew. I don't know if you remember that, but we just didn't know what to do with this hot potato. The right of return is yet one more problem at the table. Definitely not the simplest problem, but it is possible to solve this problem, and we must begin talking about it. And anyone who considers a solution in the terms of another Oslo, another agreement, another photo ops, more territorial blocks, or some technical agreement, then we will end up just as we ended up with Oslo, with this great disappointment, because Oslo did not reach out on much more preliminary issues, even more basic than the right of return. The greatest crime of Oslo, they didn't dare reach out to deal with the most important topic, the settlements. Just if you can wrap up, please. She's accidentally said one sentence to correct, and she meant it to wrap up. Okay, so to correct, I can say that everything I've said so far I was wrong. No kidding. But let me just say, as a recap, that conferences like this one or others is an attempt for dialogue. We're not in a good time. Even the occupation is not even on the agenda nowadays. These are times in which Israelis couldn't care less about the occupation, and the world doesn't care about the occupation. It's so difficult to put anything on the agenda. The media is stupid and dumbing down everyone. And look at TV. There's no place to even bring up ideas except for the newspaper where I work in. It's so very difficult today to come with this thing of the right of return and to really change something. But we know we have sufficient frustration and we have sufficient weakness, so as part of the Sisyphic nature of our struggle, we must start to talk about it. And I am completely convinced that if we start to talk about it, and if one day a brave leader will rise in Israel, we can find a just solution for this matter as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay,
let me just ask you if you have any questions, please speak into the mic. We will take in 3 questions and then I will refer them to the speakers. Well then.
I will say it in English. I want to ask Mr. Bell from the Christian Aid. We're talking about the country inhabitants, and we know that almost 55% of the Jews in Israel, they are families and descendants of refugees from Arab countries, Jewish refugees from Arab countries. And my brother from BADIL, he was talking about dealing with the symptom and not dealing with the global cause. And I want to say that there were 2 sets of refugees in this in this cause, what we are talking about. The Jewish refugees from Arab countries and the Palestinian refugees. And these are results of the same factors in the 20th century in the Middle East, of the same historical and political events.
אני רק מתנצלת בזמן שזמננו קצר.
I would like to apologize. We don't have a long time. If you could reach the question mark.
The exchange population occurred. So the Jewish community is very ancient, of thousands of years, like Babylon Jewry community. It was ethnical cleansed, totally cleansed. So I want to ask you, Mr. Bell, about the double standard or different standard of human rights when talking about refugees. And if we are seeking a solution, we would, I want you to pay attention to the law that was decided in the Knesset on 2010, in the Israeli parliament. That there will be no.
Sorry, I must interrupt you.
About Palestinian rights without talking about a negotiation about the Jewish refugees from Arab countries' rights. So what do you suggest for a good solution and with justice for all?
Okay,
we know that the Arab League contributes.
I'm sorry, our time is short. I do apologize. We'll take another question.
Germany and Britain and France and
אני חושבת שהשאלה מובנת.
Apologize. I think your question has been understood. We'll take another question to be fair. Okay, from that other side. Most speakers talked about the refugees of 48 and 67, and I think we are shooting our own foot when doing so, because being refugees, that's been around for 150 years, because those who are against us will always be able to say that 48 and 67, that's a result of a war. But if we attack the phenomena of refugees in a broader way and go back to our children's songs, Dunam here and Eduman here, the land is being redeemed. From whom is it being redeemed? Or the greatest slogan of Zionism, from a nation without a land to a land without a nation, we'll understand the basic problem. We simply didn't recognize the Arab nation since the late 19th century, and people can see how was the kibbutz established, how were the moshavim established in the first aliyahs, in the first immigration waves and onwards. If you look at that, you understand the problem. Okay, and a third question before we respond. I wanted to address the same point and remind you that serfs were expropriated before the establishment of the state, and this was made possible because of the landowners. I think that what was missing here, and perhaps this is an idea for your next conference, that is to connect all the reasons for oppression and control that men have over women, a very specific definition of masculinity that has to do with the protection of property, and women are property and land is property, and power relations that are found in many junctions, for example, between men and women, between culture and nature, between Jews and Arabs, and of course we can add so many couplings to this. I'd like to receive an answer to that question. Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure whether you were here earlier, but I think that point was very well answered by Munir Nusebi, and I think that there's an obvious agreement that there were many Jewish refugees of that same period, up to 1 million, as I understand it, from Arab countries within the Middle East and North Africa. And as Munir said earlier, though, I think that of course their rights should be addressed, and there should be a focus on that. But the issue of the Palestinian right of return and addressing that shouldn't be incumbent upon that. It's not that until one addresses the issue of Jewish refugees inside of Israel who came from Arab states, that we shouldn't address the issue of Palestinian refugees. They're not, and I think that there wouldn't be many Palestinian refugees, as you know, I can't speak for all Palestinian refugees, I wouldn't even try to, but I cannot imagine that they would say, of course we mustn't talk about Jewish refugees. I think that, as I hope came across in my speech, that actually dealing with the Palestinian refugee issue is critical for two reasons. One, clearly for the humanitarian and political rights of the Palestinian refugees themselves, but also for the way in which refugees of the future and indeed of the past in the situation that you're talking about can be addressed. In other words, let's not throw away refugee rights. This is not about picking and choosing which refugees of which nationality we address. All refugee rights need to be preserved and protected, whether they be Jewish, Palestinian, whatever.
I would like to address this question as well on refugees from Arab countries. Taking the rights-based approach and also referring to what Nuseba said earlier, adopting a rights-based approach means that all refugees all over the world have rights, and their rights should be protected and should be implemented. In the case of refugees from Arab countries, this is not a specialty of my organization or myself, but if they are refugees, so indeed, yes, Jewish refugees from Arab countries should have the rights and protected as well, and their rights should be tested against criteria of international law. It is not for me to decide. And like William said, we cannot equalize or put one against other the rights of Palestinian refugees or rights of any other refugees around the world. The rights of Palestinian refugees should be protected and implemented, and the rights of other refugees should be implemented. We cannot exchange one for one, or we cannot trade them off against each other. And finally, my organization, BADIL, have published a position paper, a detailed position paper on this subject particularly, and you can find it on our website. I can give you the details later. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to respond to the
I just want to say, okay. I just want to say one thing in English. I agree that all refugee rights should be respected, but even before talking about the right of Jewish Arabs for right of return to their homelands, I think let's start from the very beginning to give at least the very privileges that Jewish Arabs have today, where the Palestinians refugees don't have at least access to their homelands. A lot of Palestinians with even foreign passports, and a lot of Palestinians refugees in the Arab world don't have even the access or the right to enter their homeland just for a visit, okay? While many of the Arab Jewish... Yeah, okay, but many can visit like Morocco, many can visit the north of... Yeah, okay, we can talk about exceptions, but let's talk about the very general. Let's talk about the majority of... there is a lot of Jewish today from Arab countries that they can still visit, Morocco, they can still visit in special trips like Algeria or even Egypt, while many others, refugee Palestinians, they cannot even have the access even for a visit to their homeland in 48.
Okay. We will take 3 other questions, okay, and then we will have to conclude. Just to remind you, if you can combine your answers, there was a question regarding the combining between oppressions to the issue of return. Okay, so.
Okay, thank you. Qusay from the Haitian refugee camp. First of all, I would just like to say that Palestinian refugees have lived in the exile for 65 years, and everyone should consider that the Palestinians have built their life and built the social fabric and built the life in the exile, despite it staying in the exile. I'm from Dahisha, where they're living 64 villages. There's a social fabric between these communities. So wondering about who will return, who will stay, that's something debatable about the refugees issue. So it's really a very beyond thing. The other thing is, my question is, away from idealism and considering the global situation today, do we really believe in the human rights conventions and democracy and all of these things? not looking only to Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but also considering, for example, Syria and what's going on in Syria. One country in the world said veto on a resolution of interfering there and to stop killing people there, but the whole world was stopped because of one country decision. Do we still believe in these convictions? Instead, because we're using them a lot in talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Eh,
Just one request, if you can keep that questions short so we can enable the speakers to answer.
I don't have a question. I have just to say something. بدي أحكي بالعربي. الدكتور منار تحدث عن السياق.
Dr. Manar talked about the context. I think that when we talk about the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian refugees, the context that is not being discussed, that is being ignored, is the Arab-Muslim context in our region, in historic Palestine, etc. What I always say to my friends and colleagues, the Jewish colleagues whom I meet and whom I work with, is that it is the Jewish group in Israel that needs to be concerned, because from a historic perspective, if Jewish concern focuses on how, even before the Zionist movement in the Golden Era, when Maimonides, for example, when Maimonides was the private physician of Saladin Ayyubi, as peoples, as cultures, if we wish to preserve this form of work, then the Jews need to be concerned with their future, because the force cannot last forever. And this is something we can learn from the experience of other nations in the world. We need to think from now on how to convince the Israeli Jew that there is a victim, and that victim is a Palestinian, but there is a future victim. There could be a future victim when this force, the Jewish force, will end. And Gidon talked about it. There was a session about the language, and you, Gidon, Dr. Gidon, I just gave you a degree. You talked about the language, and in your talk you said that the State of Israel can take in the refugees just like it took in the Russian new immigrants, that this establishment, but you didn't talk about new concepts. Why not call a spade a spade? Why not say that the Zionist movement created a certain regime, a colonial regime here that was no different to any other colonial regime in the world, and in order to implement the refugees' right of return and for the Jews to be able to live next to the Arabs with relative wealth, you need to deconstruct this colonial regime. This needs to be said sincerely, loud and clear, and I do not see any perplexion in saying that to my Jewish friends. We need to aspire to a shared, peaceful, stable life, and this won't happen if we don't get rid of Zionist colonialism, and if the Jews overprivileged will not give up their privileges. Sorry, we must finish, and I'd like to ask to allow others to speak.
أنه عندي إشكالية مع ربط موضوع العودة مع موضوع المواطنة أو أولى أو في المقدمة لعودة اللاجئين أو حتى اللاجئين الداخليين، لأن أنا بفكر إنه في صراع مع إسرائيل وحكوماتها ونظامها الاستعماري هو الموضوع قضية وقت، فبالتالي أنا بفكر إنه
and it's the issue of ending colonialism. It's only a matter of time to talk about the time and not to talk about being active and linking it with citizenship. It is a great risk, as we see Abu Mazen saying, I don't want to go back to Safed because he has special interests now. And also years ago, I don't remember who decided with the 13 martyrs to take it to the court, and they also prosecuted an officer too. That's how we'll solve the problem. Okay, so just a moment for answers because we must finish this panel. Some of the panelists need to leave. I apologize. I really need to go now. If you'll come to dinner, I can continue speaking with you there, but I really must leave now. Let me just say two more things that I haven't said. We also need to recognize the fact that you cannot solve one problem by creating another one, a new one. And therefore, I at least don't think that the problem of return, the problem of refugees, I don't think it can be solved by creating new refugees. Yet, I also think that even before we've reached the issue of return, I do not wish to live in a country in which Jews from the Sephardic committee in Sheikh Jarrah are entitled to return to their homes according to the instructions of the court because their property was saved for them from before 1948, while Palestinians who make the exact same claim, including citizens of this country, they are prevented from returning to their homes. And whenever I list the apartheid evidence, this is one of these items. It's a very clear-cut piece of evidence, and these things need to be brought up to consciousness because there is no answer to these things, because nobody can explain to me how come the committee of the Sephardim in Sheikh Jarrah are more entitled than a resident of Zakaria or a resident of any other village. Ikrit Uviram, of course. And as for your question, that you so generously giving me my PhD. Look, we didn't get into this today, and it's a completely different topic. Are we going for a one-state solution, and then indeed we need to deconstruct or get rid of the Zionist regime, and we're going to establish a completely different regime here, or are we opting for the two-state solution? My own personal view is that since I think it's too late for a two-state solution, and I'm saying this quite cautiously. I guess it's too late for that, so the question doesn't even remain. I mean, the two-state option is disappearing. Perhaps it's already disappeared. Maybe it's in its very last dying moments. I'm quite skeptical if it can even be realized, so we remain only with the second solution, and the second solution needs to surface only one question, and that's rights for all, and then indeed we will have a different regime here. Yes, say equal rights to all the people living here. There's no reason how we can explain how people from one nation have a right and others don't. And the Israelis have said no to a two-state solution for 40 years, and since they've kept saying no to this option until it's become impossible, now it is up to them to deal with the rights. Excuse me that I must leave now. Well, you know what? Actually, unless one of you has a closing sentence, we will end with that. Yes, I have one thing to say.
For each of you, and we'll conclude the panel.
اوكي وافي انت سالت سؤال بخصني انا بس بدي اوضح انه
Wafe, you've asked a question that has to do with me. I'd like to say that in 1948 the Palestinians and many of us were displaced while we are being excluded from any political process related to the Palestinian issue. Our issue, the institutions which represent all the Palestinians, such as the PLO and the negotiations that's taking place right now, or any setting that gets to decide on the Palestinians, we're an integral part of them, but we are excluded from the negotiations. Therefore, I think that as Palestinians, as local leadership, as third sector, civilian institutions, and the parties, we must use our special place inside in order to realize our right, our return. Not to exclude others, to emphasize our right of return as a nation, as a collective, will remain and survive because there are Palestinians that deal with this. So this request does exist, but we, the Palestinians in this country, when we are excluded from every track or process in which decisions are being reached regarding the right of return, we must try to obtain this right from within, and not far from everything that's going on, but be due to our special status, because they don't recognize us in UNRWA. The PLO doesn't recognize us. The PLO doesn't represent us as a part of the Palestinian nation. Israel, it doesn't take care of that, and we're not part of any process. We're never included in these processes, and therefore I think that out of our special status in Israel, and since we have the greatest means and capability to reach the displaced villages, and we have access to the materials in Hebrew, and we have the ability to plan and build the most modern towns and villages. I think we need to stop dreaming and to start building and implementing return, to just come to submit plans and programs for the establishment of these localities and villages. There are displaced villages that are still considered as green areas and national parks, and we can ask or demand that these places will be allocated to us. We need to pass from a request of expanding our outlying territories, the villages and the towns, and to start to demand to build new towns and villages that will satisfy the needs, our natural population growth needs and our daily needs. One last thing, I think that citizenship as well, when we talk about basic rights, this challenges the entire democracy of Israel for the right of return and the return to the uprooted villages that are waiting for us. These rights should underlie our demands. We need to talk about the internal right of return, and this cannot be dissociated with the international context that emphasizes the right of return. Thank you very much. Just one more comment for Wafi. On the personal plane, I don't completely agree with Khulood and her answer. I think that all Palestinians, those who are citizens inside Israel and others, need to work within frameworks, and the decision that the Palestinians inside Israel, will use their citizenship and how to do that. This has to be a collective decision and not a personal one. As Palestinians, we need to work in cooperation with all the Palestinians, especially the refugees, but that's a decision that everybody needs to decide together as a collective decision. For Kusai.
He's asking, do we still believe in human rights? Yes, definitely. That's if we give up human rights, we are left with nothing. يمكن فهمت غلط. على السياق العربي الإسلامي المحيط. طبعا هذا لما بدنا نتوجه للموضوع ونحاول نخاطب المجتمع اليهودي بإسرائيل بالنسبة لحق العودة وكل هذه الشغلات وكل التصورات المستقبلية والعودة إلى السابق وكل السياق التاريخي، طبعا هذا إشي لازم نتطرق له، بس من ناحية السياق التاريخي نتطرق للسياق اللي بتطرق لعوامل اللي أدت للتهجير، فمش للسياق التاريخي الأوسع، بس طبعا هذا الموضوع اللي لازم يتطرق له بخطاب شوي أوسع. شكرا.
Thank you, Manar. And one concluding sentence, William. One, I mean by one.
Merely an observation that we had the conversation. No one died.
Okay. So, okay, thank you very much, William, Manar, Khulood, and to Gidon, who left. Thank you very much.
Let me just remind you that registration begins tomorrow morning at 9:30. I was asked to remind you to keep the tickets. You will be requested to use them later on during the day. Thank you very much.